since we're spending the day sitting in Zazen, I thought this would be a good opportunity to look at one of our classic Zen teachings on Zazen, a teaching from our Chinese ancestor Hongzhi Zhengjue, who lived in the 12th century China. Maybe one of the most important Shaodong Zen ancestors in China. Shaodong is the Chinese way of saying Soto. Very important teacher, ancestor for Dogen Zenji in Japan. Hongzhi is not in our direct lineage, but he's kind of a closely related branch of Shaodong. And one of my favorite teachings of Hongzhi's is a poem. He wrote a lot of poems expressing his understanding of Zazen. But this one's called The Acupuncture Needle of Zazen. In Japanese, Zazenshin. The acupuncture needle of Zazen, or the lancet of Zazen, or the acupuncture needle for Zazen. You could understand it either way. In other words, Zazen itself is a healing acupuncture needle. To applied correctly, it can cure all diseases. But we could also understand this to be the acupuncture needle that's applied precisely the right place that cures misunderstandings about Zazen. The lancet that cures, that heals misconceptions about Zazen. So acupuncture needle for Zazen. When Dogen's commenting on this poem of Hongzhi, he says, these days in China, there are thousands and thousands of practitioners. So nobody really understands Zazen. That they write treatises about Zazen, but they don't quite get it, except for this one by Hongzhi. He says it like it is. So in this way, we could hear this poem as a lancet for Zazen. Shin literally means acupuncture needle, but it could also be translated as the point of Zazen, or admonitions for Zazen. In old China, they used, both in the Zen world and I think outside of Buddhism too, when they would write like a treatise on a kind of like a strong admonition for how to practice some art or some meditation, they call it an acupuncture needle. So it has this colloquial meaning of like instructions or admonitions. In this case, for sitting meditation, Zazen. Zuochanzhen in Chinese, or Zazenshin in Japanese. By Hongzhi Zhengjue, whose name means spacious wisdom, true awakening. So I'll read you this short poem, and then we can look at Dogen's line by line comments, unpacking it. The essential function of all Buddhas, the functional essence of all ancestors, is knowing without touching things, illumining without facing objects, knowing without touching things. The knowing is naturally subtle, illumining without facing objects. The illumining is naturally wondrous. The knowing, naturally subtle. It is already ever without discriminating thought. The illumining, naturally wondrous. It is ever without a hair's breadth of separation. Ever without discriminating thought. Its knowing is singular without comparison. Ever without a hair's breadth of separation. Its illumining is complete without grasping. The water is clear right through to the bottom. A fish goes slowly, slowly through. The sky is vast without boundary. A bird flies far, far away. This is the acupuncture needle of Zazen, for Zazen, as expressed by Hongzhi. Beautiful, poetic Zazen instruction that is unsurpassed, according to Dogen Zenji, who lived about 80 years later than Hongzhi. They never got to meet. So I think the wonder of this kind of poem becomes revealed when we start to really delve into it and explore these words. So it starts with the essential function of all Buddhas and the functional essence of all ancestors. So in Chinese Buddhism, the whole practice and understanding is often expressed as this pair, a little bit like the Heart Sutra expresses it as form and emptiness, but in China they also often call it essence and function. So the essence is like the unchanging source, the inconceivable, ungraspable, ultimate reality. That's the essence. And the function is the changing, dynamic activity of this unchanging stillness of the essence. So they go together. We can't really have essence without function or function without essence. Just like we can't have form without emptiness or emptiness without form. Two sides of a coin, two ways of expressing what is ungraspable, inconceivable, unchanging essence, and the observable, constantly changing expression of the function. How, in other words, how Buddha's activity functions in the world to benefit beings. The essence has to function, or else it's of no use to us. That's the kind of gist of this pair, essence and function. So, or in Japanese, we'd say the essence is pronounced yo, and the function is pronounced ki. This ki, sometimes we translate it as like dynamic function or activity, or it even means like machine, or loom that weaves the ancient brocade. So in this poem, Hongzhi very nicely kind of, with Chinese language is, you can kind of condense a bunch of thought into just a few words. So it's in Japanese, we pronounce it, this first line, Yoki Butsu Butsu. Butsu is Buddha. Right? So literally like essence, function, Buddha, Buddha, literally. Well, could translate it as the essential function of all Buddhas, or the essential function of Buddha after Buddha. And then the next line is kind of in fact, this whole poem is kind of made up of these couplets, like pairs of verses. So the next line is kind of the sort of the other side, almost like the reverse. So instead of yo ki, this next line is ki yo. So this translation is the functional essence of ancestor after ancestor. The first line is yo ki butsu butsu. The second line is ki yo so so. So is ancestor, which in Zen means the Zen ancestors that continue the lineage. After the Buddhas, then after Shakyamuni Buddha and the 7 ancient Buddhas, then the dharmas passed on through the ancestors. So Dogen likes using this phrase, Buddhas and ancestors. Many, many hundreds of times, Buddhas and ancestors is like, we could say, well, isn't that almost the same thing? But if we say, well, what's the difference between Buddhas and ancestors? I think in this poem, it's being expressed as Buddhas are like the essence. Buddha is inconceivable. It's ungraspable suchness. That's actually what Buddha is. But the ancestors are these human beings that try to express this Buddha and live this Buddha. So the ancestors are like the functioning aspect, and the Buddhas are like the essence that gives rise to these functioning ancestors. Can you follow that? So I think that's what Hongzhi is playing with here, this pair of essence and function, and then this pair of Buddhas and ancestors. So the two lines together are the essential function of all the Buddhas, the functional essence of all the ancestors. So why is he even bringing this up? Because this is Zazen. This whole, every line here is about sitting meditation. What is Zazen? Zazen is the essential function of all the Buddhas and the functional essence of all the ancestors. So the first line, Dogen Zenji, right, our Japanese lineage founder, who he wrote an essay in 1242. He says himself, 80 years after Hongzhi wrote this poem. And Dogen is celebrating this poem, commenting on this poem. And you can find it in Dogen's Shobogenzo essay called The Acupuncture Needle of Zazen, which is much longer, but it ends with Dogen's comments on Hongzhi's poem. So for the first line, the essential function of all Buddhas, Dogen has various comments, but let's pull out some of the essential ones. Dogen says, this is Zazen. The essential function of all Buddhas, Dogen says, this is Zazen. And the functional essence of all ancestors, Dogen comments, this is transmitting the Dharma, transmitting the robe. So there's something here about the essential function of all Buddhas is this ungraspable Zazen. And then the functional essence of the ancestors is transmitting the Dharma. In this case, we could say transmitting the understanding of Zazen, of the Buddhas, has to be transmitted by the ancestors. And they transmit a robe along with that mark it. Dogen also comments here, changing the face is the essential function. Turning the head is the functional essence. So you can see that Dogen's comments elucidating this poem maybe are more difficult to understand than the original poem. They're poetic expressions, their functions. This is how the Zen ancestors comment on the Zen ancestors. They're not trying to confuse us. I would say they're trying to help us without letting us grasp anything along the way. Changing the face is the essential function. We might say the essence is changing the face. Like we have this face that we think is ourself, and realizing the essence is realizing our original face. It doesn't look like this. We change our apparent face into our original face that doesn't look like anything. So changing the face is the essential function of the Buddhas. Inconceivable. And turning the head is the functional essence. So there are various Zen stories from the old days in China, like monks will come to a teacher and say, what is the like functioning of Buddha nature? And the teacher will say something like, I'll show you, just a minute. And then watching a novice monk walk by, and the teacher say, hey, you. And the novices, huh? They turn their head, and the teachers would say, there it is, the perfect functioning of Buddha nature. So changing the face is like revealing the essence of our original face before our parents were born. And turning the head is just like this ordinary functioning of Buddha. It's just like responding, immediate response to, hey, you, yeah? Turning the head is the spontaneous Buddha function based on, it can be really spontaneous and free-flowing function if it's based on changing our face to our original face. Then we can really respond freshly. That's my comment on Dogen's comment. Changing the face is the essential function, you could say, of all the Buddhas. Turning the head is the functional essence of all the ancestors. That's kind of, we might say, a philosophical prelude to the rest of the poem. This whole business of essence and function. And now the actual heart of the Zazen instruction, I would say, is these next two lines. And then the rest of the poem just embellishes this heart of Zazen. So this next line is, knowing without touching things. And you might say, well, this is building on these first two lines, the essential function and the functional essence. What is this? How do we, it sounds kind of abstract, a little bit philosophical. What is it actually? The essential function and the functional essence. It is knowing without touching things. Knowing here is pronounced chi in Japanese, and it's the way Chinese translate the Sanskrit word jnana. Jnana means knowing. Also, it can be translated as awareness. And it's particularly, if we look carefully at this word jnana, it's a kind of non-dual knowing, non-dual awareness. We have this other Sanskrit word, vijnana, the fifth aggregate. Vijnana, usually translated as consciousness. And the vi, just like similar anyway to the English word vi, like vivisection, divide, division, is kind of like to split into two. So vijnana, consciousness, is literally, we could say, divided knowing. It's dualistic knowing that seems to touch things. But jnana is undivided knowing. And this is the word that the Tibetans translated as yeshe, which is a very important term in, all of Tibetan Buddhism, but particularly like the Dzogchen tradition. Yeshe is kind of literally the way that the Tibetans translate jnana into yeshe. Literally means, often is translated as timeless awareness, yeshe, timeless awareness, or primordial knowing. These are kind of common translations of yeshe. So they're really, the Tibetans kind of like nuancing this jnana a little bit by ye means like timeless or primordial, and she is like nya, knowing. And in Chinese, this is the character that Hongzhi is using, knowing without touching things. So it's not an intellectual knowing, it's not a conceptual knowing here. Some centuries before Hongzhi, in the early Zen tradition in China, people like Jose Shunwei, this is like the time of the sixth ancestor. I think he was the one who coined this popular phrase, the single word knowing, it's the same character, the single word awareness is the gateway to all wonders, is the source of all mysteries. This is all kind of like this single word, in other words, this is all we need. This is what Zen is based on according to this Southern school. This one word, knowing or awareness, just fully investigate this. It's the gateway to all wonders. And later Sung Mi liked to quote that line, and in Korea, Chinu liked to quote that line. So there's a connection to in the 12th century, Hongzhi's, maybe he was influenced by Shunwei, kind of using this as the heart of his Zazen instruction. What is Zazen? It's knowing without touching things. And touching here, or meeting, I could say, touching is the Chinese character that's used for the Sanskrit term sparsha, which means like contact or touching. So some of you might know the old Indian teaching of the Buddha on the 12-fold chain of causation. It's kind of like a 12 links of dependent arising that is just basically describing the causation of suffering. It's really what it's doing. It's kind of it starts with ignorance and it ends with suffering, but it describes the process, how ignorance creates suffering. So it's a wonderful teaching of the Buddha. And without going into all the 12 links of causation, to focus in on this issue of touching, one of the middle links is the 6 senses. So like eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mental sense. And these 6 senses, each of the sense faculties has an object. So the eye there's an eye sense, and a color is the object of eyes, and an ear, hearing sense, and a sound, and so on. So the Buddha says in this early kind of like renowned teaching, this 12-fold chain of causation is really important in the early Buddhist tradition. The Buddha says, dependent on these 6 senses and their objects, there's contact. And that's this word that Hongzhi is using as touching. Dependent on like an eye and a color, there's contact, which means if you have an eye and a color, and dependent on that setup of an eye and a color, they can meet, they can contact, they can touch. And then, so that's the next link. The first one link is the 6 senses. Depending on that link, there is contact. In other words, you need a sense faculty and an object in order for there to be contact. And then the Buddha says, dependent on contact, there's feeling. And in this case, feeling is not really emotion. It just means there's either a pleasant or an unpleasant experience, depending on that contact. If it's a color, a pleasant color, and it meets the eye, then there's a pleasurable feeling. If there's an unpleasant sound and it meets the ear, then there's an unpleasant experience. And depending on that feeling, pleasant and unpleasant, then there's craving, more of the pleasant and less of the unpleasant. Depending on craving, there's grasping and becoming and birth, old age, sickness, and death, and the whole mass of suffering, as the Buddha says. So I just bring this up because it looks to me like one of the really important links in this 12-fold chain is contact. As soon as you have this dualistic setup, if you can have like a sense faculty and a sense object, that's called like two things. It's called duality. And as soon as you have that setup, you have the possibility of contacting the faculty and the object. And then that contact is almost like the birthplace of all suffering. That's weird. Just seeing a color is the birthplace of all suffering. Hearing a sound. It's kind of like the Buddha was into some kind of like subtle stuff about how just our dualistic perception creates big problems. So, is there any way out of this? I mean, as soon as we open our eyes, don't we see a color? As soon as we open our ears, don't we hear a sound? It seems to be external to ourselves. It seems to be out there. So the eye, my eye over here touches the color over there. My ear over here touches the sound over there. That's like duality. And that contact is in the realm of duality, like this is problematic, the Buddha is saying. Is there an alternative? I think that's what Hongzhi is proposing. The Zazen. There can be a Zazen that is knowing. In other words, it's not like we have to like turn off our mind, stop all awakeness, or just try to go to sleep when we don't have any contact. No, we can be wide awake, knowing, but this special kind of knowing, this unusual kind of knowing, it's not touching things. Knowing without touching things, knowing without contact. And I would say this is like the central line of this 10-line poem, however many it is. Zazen is knowing, an awareness, an undivided knowing, an undivided awareness, primordial, timeless awareness that doesn't contact things. Why doesn't it contact things? Because there are no things outside of itself. We feel as if our mind is kind of in here and the world of objects is out there. And when we feel that way, that's the setup for contact, or touching things. In other words, in order to touch something, that thing must be over there. It must be at some distance that the eye or the ear or even the finger can reach out and touch a thing out there. Right? That's called duality. There's me over here, and I, meaning like my eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, can touch the objects out there. So we usually assume reality is, but the Buddhas are saying it's not really that way. It appears that way, but it's not really that way. Essentially, it's not that way. So we have to explore this knowing, and in addition to it being timeless, this kind of knowing is not a knowing that's changing, it's an unchanging knowing. We can explore in Zazen the timelessness of this awareness, but also the boundlessness of this very awareness, this ordinary knowing. It seems like it's over here. If it's over here inside my body or around my body, then that would be a kind of boundary. And then if it has a boundary, then there can be things outside of it for the knowing to touch. But if it literally doesn't have a boundary at all, it doesn't have an edge. If this knowing doesn't have an edge or boundary, and if we can confirm that this and verify in our own zazen that this knowing awareness doesn't have any edges or boundaries, that very confirmation is not touching things. In other words, if there's no edge to it, there can't be anything outside it. So these colors and sounds that knowing seems to touch, seems to contact, are actually not outside of awareness. Are they inside of awareness then? In a way, we could say if there's no boundaries, then everything that's happening, every experience that's happening is happening in awareness. But we could go even further in investigating our zazen in this way and see that actually all this stuff, all these experiences that are happening, it's not even quite perfectly accurate to say that they're happening in awareness. It's more that they actually are the awareness itself. In other words, the sound that we're hearing is just the knowing of the sound. The sights that we're seeing are themselves nothing other than awareness itself. That's what non-dual awareness, primordial knowing is like. And in this non-dual awareness, contact is impossible. Because for contact, you need something outside to touch. If there is no outside, there's no contact. Another Zen ancestor, Baizhang, once said, if you can come to see how mind and objects never contact, same point. If you can realize that the mind and its objects never meet, you'll be set free on the spot. It's Baizhang's Zazen instruction. And going back to the Buddha's 12-fold chain, they say there's various places you can break the chain. This is the chain that leads to suffering. So you can kind of like dismantle the links of the chain, really at any of the 12 links. It's a circle, and you can kind of, you could like, where there's links, you can look very carefully and kind of break the chain there. It's taught, especially in the like Theravada tradition. But here we can say, Hongzhi is talking about breaking the chain at this point called contact. Like you could have the appearance of six senses, like eye and color, but if we see that the color is nothing other than just seeing itself, it's not external to mind, that is breaking the chain at this point of contact. In other words, dependent on the six senses, we look carefully and there is no contact. There can't be contact. There's no touching. So I think this is an early Buddhist teaching, a subtle one, right? Buddha was not saying this is easy, but I mean, if we're talking about ending suffering, if it were easy, everyone would have done it by now because everybody wants to end suffering. So it takes some careful investigation in stillness. This would be Buddha's way of talking. Baizhang would say, just come to see that the senses and their objects never meet or touch, and you'll be set free on the spot. And Hongzhi says, this essential function of all the Buddhas, this functioning essence of all the ancestors, it's just knowing without touching things. It's awareness without contacting anything. Then Dogen's comment on this line, Dogen says, this knowing or awareness is not sense perception, the way we usually think of sense perception. And it does not mean understanding or comprehension or intellectual knowing. So he's kind of pointing out, don't think that this knowing is like the senses contacting objects. Don't think that it means intellectual knowing, which is fabricated, Dogen says. Conceptual knowing is just fabricated knowing. This knowing, so those are the things that it's not. What is it, Dogen? Dogen says, this knowing is not touching things. This is really good, I think. So the original line is, what's Zazen? It's knowing without touching things. And then we ask Dogen, what is this knowing? Dogen says, this knowing is simply not touching things. That's what it is. And what is this not touching things? What is this not contact? What is this realm where there's no contact? It is knowing. So what is knowing? Knowing is not touching things. And not touching things is knowing. Then Dogen caps off his kind of longer commentary here on this line by saying, it is to sit through the skin born from a mother. We know that studying Dogen is not easy. Wow. It is to sit through the skin born of a mother. So something about this face the skin face that we think we are. It's to sit right through this skin face that the skin face was born from a mother. Right? It's to sit through this skin born from a mother to who we really are. Who we really are is not born from a mother. Who we are is not born. what is our true nature, our true unborn nature? Sounds kind of abstract, right? What is our true unborn nature? To bring it kind of down to earth, practical, we could say, it is simply knowing without touching things. What is our original face before our parents were born, not to mention before we were born? It's this very awareness. But to qualify that, make sure that we don't think that this is dualistic knowing or conceptual knowing. It's this very awareness that can't touch anything because there isn't anything other than it. If there were anything other than awareness, we would have a big problem because we have the setup for contact. But what about that tree, like way, way out there? What about that snow mountain, way, way over there? In another essay of Dogen, he says, mountains, rivers, and the great earth are mind. And then kind of fleshing that out a bit, he says, this mountains, rivers, and earth mind is nothing other than mountains, rivers, and earth. Like the mountain isn't going to suddenly start looking a different way. It's just that mountain. That mountain is the mountain mind. And here we're talking about visual objects, but it's important to remember that all six senses are included in this touching or not touching business. So in fact, visual sights are maybe the hardest one to really accept that they're not out there. I think it's easier to warm up to it with, for example, sounds. You know, if our eyes are closed and we're listening to sound, it's a little easier, I think, to open to the sound is nothing other than the knowing of it. The sound is not external to awareness. It's not that there's an ear consciousness that's contacting a sound that's out there. If we're very habituated to believing it is so, but in our own direct experience, with listening to sound with the eyes closed, I think it's not so difficult to open to the possibility that the sound, putting aside all our ideas and theories about this, in direct experience, there is just knowing that's taking the form of what we call sound. There is awareness expressing itself as sound. And same with bodily sensations. I feel that there's a mind that's contacting this particular, pain in the butt or something, right? But actually, what if that sensation that we call the body is nothing other than knowing? If the sensation is just the knowing, and the knowing is our true nature, unborn, always okay, indestructible, unchanging presence, then this, even if it's a painful sensation, it's more like a miracle that knowing our original face can manifest, it can express itself, can take the form of this throbbing sensation. It's miraculous. So, and thoughts are harder to work with, I think, because as soon as we're caught in the content of thoughts, we're missing the point of investigating what is the thought. The thought is nothing other than the knowing of the thought. But if we're involved in the content, then we easily forget this. So I think while we have this day of sitting today, I think bodily sensations and sounds are the most conducive experiences to deeply investigate and explore and check out the possibility that could these sounds and sensations, these ordinary sounds and sensations that are going on all day long, could it be that these are nothing other than knowing? Slightest shift of perspective, a hair's breadth shift, is like the distance between heaven and earth. It's the pivot of liberation and bondage. It's one way of talking about it. No small matter, but subtle, right? And if we're busy, like thinking of planning our future and worrying about the past, then this is too subtle for that. So this is just a little note, maybe obvious, but like in a day of sitting like this, first we really have to settle into the present. First we really settle our breathing, settle our posture, relax into the present, and start really enjoying the present. And then we can look deeper like this. So that's the I think a really essential line. Knowing without touching things. Or literally, the way the Chinese verse goes is not touching things, yet knowing. And so now the next line is, it's illumining without facing objects. Really, same thing, same point. That's why I think these two lines are two different ways of saying the same things. And it's just, I feel like this is the heart of Zazen in our tradition. It's really opening to non-dual awareness that's always present and available, and verifying it. So it's not just kind of like just relaxing into the present. It's actually exploring, looking deeply at these very subtle points, not in a conceptual way. The instructions come in conceptual words, so it maybe starts in a slightly conceptual way, but it's really trying to stay with our direct experience. Right around this issue of contact and inside outside, these issues. So it's illumining. This is Japanese word sho, that means like shining or illuminating. And Hongzhi, who wrote this poem, is known for teaching a kind of zazen that he sometimes called silent illumination. In Japanese, moku sho. So it's the same sho as illumining. Silent illumination, which is another pair, like function and essence, that Hongzhi comments on elsewhere. He has another poem about silent illumination. Silence is like the essence, the unchanging essence. and illumination is like the function. So it's illuminating, shining, without facing objects, or you could translate that as without encountering conditions, or even opposing conditions. So it's Zazen, it's knowing without touching things, and it's illuminating without facing objects. Illuminating is another way of talking about knowing. It's knowing is like light, but this is like a boundless light, like the light that fills the entire sky, as opposed to like a beam of light. Sometimes it seems like consciousness is like a beam of light, and we like, okay, like look at the mountain, and the light beam goes out and touches the mountain. So it's not like a light beam, this knowing, it's more like all of space illuminated with brightness. That's the kind of Zazen here. It's not like we can illuminate objects by looking at them or listening to them or feeling them or thinking of them. It's kind of illumination, but that's the dualistic kind that faces objects and touches them. But there can be an illuminating, a boundless illuminating, in which all sights and sounds and sensations and thoughts are appearing and disappearing. And again, you could say, all these things are happening in awareness. It's a huge shift from their happening out there. They're happening to awareness. If they're happening to awareness, that's the realm of touching and duality. If they're happening in awareness, that's like a big shift of perspective, isn't it? But still maybe slightly dualistic, because you have awareness and then the things in it. Like this, the furniture in this room is in the space of the room, but it's still like, we're saying that the space of the room is one thing and the furniture is another thing. Slight separation. But if we say the sights and the sounds and the sensations are the space, like illumination, the boundless knowing itself, that's complete non-duality. There's no further stepping back. There's no separation at all. The sound of the bird is simply knowing. Illuminating without encountering or facing objects. And Dogen's comment is, this illuminating does not mean complete understanding. Maybe again, a kind of conceptual illumination or spiritual illumination, some maybe new age version of everything is so bright and illuminated. Not like that kind of illumination. It's very ordinary, always ever present illumination. This one. And again, Dogen says, like he did in the previous comment, without facing objects is illuminating. Again, Zazen, Hongzhi says Zazen means illuminating without facing objects. Dogen says, well, what is this without facing objects? Without facing objects is the illuminating. That's non-duality. Dogen goes on, illuminating does not change into the object, for the object itself is the illuminating. He just says it like it is. He lays it out. He doesn't hold back. Illuminating does not change into the object. It's not really that there is this awareness that's becoming an object. We might sometimes think of it like that. This awareness is becoming a sound, the awareness is becoming a color and sound. It's not quite like that in non-duality. It's that the illumining does not change into the object, for the object itself is the illumining. We could also say this as appearances of sights and sounds and so on are the activity of awareness. It's not that awareness is changing into the sights and sounds. The sights and sounds are just the function or activity of the unchanging awareness. And then Dogen finishes that comment by saying, it is interacting yet not interacting. So this is a line from the Shuto's Sandokai, the merging of difference and unity. All the objects and the senses interact and yet do not. That poem says. Dogen, very apropos, Dogen would quote that line here. These senses and the objects, we might say, they seem to interact and meet and touch, but they don't really. I think that's what Sekito Kisen Shuto also means in that merging of difference and unity poem. All the objects of the senses appear to interact and yet do not really. So that's the first 4 lines. There's 6 more lines we could look at this afternoon. But for now, that's a lot of instructions about something that's so simple to Zazen, right? But yet so elusive, and so many slight sidetracks. So I kind of like that, reading this title as it's an acupuncture needle for Zazen, for mistaken dead ends and sidetracked versions of Zazen.